Hello, I'm Bob the Bookerer and welcome to my channel, and today I just wanted to talk a bit about the books that I've been reading this week. I was away on holiday and so that in some ways influenced parts of my reading, but at the same time I was fully convinced that it would be one of those holidays where I read loads, and in fact it was one where I barely read anything. And so although this looks like a few books, in some ways a little bit of this has been just before I headed out on holiday or on the plane when I suddenly fell into some really great bits of reading. But apart from that, I didn't really read much, which in some ways is the sign of a good holiday. I guess either way, if you're too kind of busy doing other things to read, or if you're so relaxed that you can read loads, both I guess are good holiday signs. But anyway, let's get started talking about the books I've read this week. First up, a book I read in one sitting on a plane, and that is Isaac by Curtis Garner. And so this is due to come out, I believe, in November. I very luckily got an advance copy at an event that I went to with Ben Reedsgood, and we got to chat to Curtis, who was lovely. But it was just really fun to read this novel. It's a coming of age novel about this young gay man sort of realizing who he is. But I feel like it avoids sort of some of the pitfalls of that type of writing and instead kind of offers quite a few fresh new things. We have the young character Isaac. He is going through sort of various parts of working out his identity, but in some ways it's less the gay thing that's the kind of coming of age per se. He's not sort of trapped in many thoughts about who he is, and in that respect it's more about his relationships that he has with others, and particularly he starts dating this pretty awful man. I say pretty awful, terrible in many ways, man. And what I think is really clever about the way the book portrays this is that Isaac is not only the kind of the younger person in a situation that's pretty horrible, trying to find his way out, he is also in many ways a voice of reason while a lot of this is happening. So we see that, you know, his first forays into sex and sexuality involve him having various hookups with people he meets online. And I thought it was really brilliantly captured. It felt very real to how some of those interactions can feel in terms of the ways that people talk to each other, the kind of almost mystifying element of some of that language, that it feels almost like you are speaking a new language and you have to very quickly pick up as a gay man, or gay or bisexual man, or anybody really within the community. You have to pick up this new way of speaking or kind of understand the various references or kind of acronyms or whatever that people use, even just in arranging a hookup. So I thought that was really well captured, but particularly the relationship that Isaac has through the majority of this book. I really felt for the character. I was really sort of following after him, hoping that he was going to be okay. But equally, I think the book very neatly captures that sense of what it means when everything is new and scary, that kind of way that when you're a teenager, sometimes you feel like both like you know nothing, but also sometimes like you know everything and you're ready to kind of go and conquer the world. And I think this book very neatly captures that dynamic in a way that I just thought was so fascinating. So yeah, really excited for this book to come out and in November and have more readers around it. But I think it's a really strong debut, and particularly a really strong way of looking at the gay coming out and kind of coming of age novel as well. So, keeping in the vein of Twinks, we have I Want That Twink Obliterated, which is a collection of short stories and sort of fiction from various writers. And I'm still just a few pages away, or a few stories away from finishing this, but I wanted to include it in this one just because I think it's really a really fun book. So as the sort of the schlocky title suggests, this is a collection that in many ways doesn't fully take itself seriously, although the writers obviously are very serious about their work. It is essentially taking the kind of campy, schlocky kind of story, like pulp stories from the 70s, sort of 60s, 70s, a bit into the 80s, particularly this kind of style of sci-fi fantasy books, you know, the very cheap, pulpy books that were you know, relatively cheap, but were, you know, mass produced and really kind of got a lot of people into reading specific things. And this is taking that and finding a queer lens on it. And so from the ones I've read so far, you've got a short story about somebody kind of going undercover to investigate people within a school, you've got these like bizarre things happening, you've got kind of space relationships, you've got all of these sorts of things. So it kind of keeps that feeling of that kind of sci-fi fantasy from the 70s or so, but really adds a new element to it about kind of queer culture or kind of queer characters or whatever else within the universe. So I just really enjoyed this. I thought this was so, at times, so stupid, but really fun. And the writers are just, are really sort of finding some incredible new ways of looking at sci-fi and fantasy and kind of injecting an additional bit of fun into them as well. Continuing on with what was a very, very gay reading week, I read The Folding Star by Alan Hollinghurst. And I'm annoyed that I don't have my copy physically here with me, so it'll be just here instead. But I was very lucky to see Alan Hollinghurst at a talk recently, and I mentioned it when I was talking about our evenings last week. And very luckily had the chance for him to sign my copy of Folding Star, which I hadn't started reading at the time of that and have now finished. Like many of Alan Hollinghurst's works, the Folding Star plays around with this idea of kind of to some degree class consciousness and kind of class against sort of sexuality. So you've got kind of characters from very different social worlds mixing, particularly around sort of sexual spaces. But I think there's something really beautiful about the way Alan Hollinghurst writes about the tenderness and sort of vulnerabilities between men. It feels very sharply observed. And so, for example, in The Folding Star, there are these various moments where these two men are really trying to understand each other. Our main character and someone who he's in love with, this man from Antwerp. And so they occasionally just have these little moments of kind of cultural exchange, as well as various other forms of exchange. Some of the moments involve things like, even one of them pointing out things, the guy from Antwerp pointing at things and the Englishman just saying the words for them in English, and sort of these little moments of sort of joy and kind of tenderness between these two men. But then there's this really, I think, as with much of the rest of Alan Hollinghurst's work that I've read so far, he writes really powerfully about sex. And the book, as with many of his, involves a lot of sex. It's very full frontal, no holds barred. He goes there with all of it. But it never feels fully, for me, like smut. It never feels like it's just tacked on. There's always something story-wise almost happening, or character development-wise happening within that. So, we see a character's vulnerabilities during sex, or we see the ways that these two men maybe don't know how to talk to each other, but can kind of have this sexual chemistry. Or we see, in one scene, without ruining something, this moment, this idea of sort of sharing your partner, watching this moment of watching his partner be with somebody else, and having this moment of trying to convince these other people, hey, this is my lover, this is, who I'm meant to be with. And everybody else sort of being like, no, step out of the way. This is, feelings don't really happen here. This is a transactional sexual space, And so I think there's something really powerful about it. And I think great as well for the fact that this was shortlisted for the Booker. And it's really fun actually thinking about it. And he said this in the talk that I saw him at, that, for him, it was really important to do that, to kind of write so visibly and so in depth about sex and sexuality, because that was sort of not seen as being a thing you're allowed. There was an article I read recently, and it sort of spoke about him being almost that Alan Hollinghurst is almost this Trojan horse of, he is this literary figure. He writes these beautiful sentences. He has these very literary, tightly crafted novels. And within those novels are also these wonderfully twisted and filthy things happening. And there's something about that I think is just so powerful, that, he sees that as being just as worthy of writing and of interrogating and thinking about as, a character who is going through a crisis, or a character who is thinking about their role in the world, or anything like that. And I think that's so, so beautiful. And last but not least, something neither gay nor fiction. This is The Blue Machine by Helen Czajewski. And this I thought was a really stunning piece of writing. I think if I remember correctly, it won the Wainwright Prize for nature writing recently. This I thought was a really exceptional way of looking at this kind of unknown quantity of the ocean. And I think particularly that there's been a lot of incredible nature writing recently, or writing about nature and conservation in so many ways, particularly at taking some of these topics that were, that to some degree could be seen as rather boring or rather dull, and taking a real look at it in a way that sort of applies it, looks at the intricacies of this. And actually, interestingly, because I'd heard of this book because of the Wainwright, and I was reading the new Richard Powers book, Playground, and in the end acknowledgements, he mentions this book. And they basically both came out, I think this came out slightly before his book. And there's something really special about that actually knowing that this book also would have helped influence Playground, which I loved so much. So the Blue Machine takes this idea and it looks at what it means, what the ocean means to humans more generally, but then it purposely adopts a non-human view of the ocean, which I know sounds obvious because it's very much not humans, but we so often look at it only in its relationship to ourselves. And so I think this book intentionally looks at, there are creatures who behave in a way that seems utterly illogical to us, by our own standards, by how we operate day to day. But actually that isn't the case for sea life or ocean life at all. They live by very different times, very different pressures, and so, that ocean doesn't exist only to serve us. It has this whole living infrastructure, hence the title of the book, this idea of the ocean as a machine that operates only when all of these things are kept in some form of equilibrium. And so, as a result, there's sort of something about, well, actually, a whale dying, hundreds of miles away, releases things into the water that feed various other parts of the water, and kind of the life around it, which then has an effect somewhere else, which then does all these other things. And I think there's something about the wonder in this book that in many ways really shows up in Playground by Richard Powers. So if you've read that book, there are parts where there's a character who's written a book about the ocean and is deeply passionate about it, and that love comes through in every single breath of that character. And the same here with the Blue Machine. There's something about the way that the author is so in love with the idea of its sort of vast possibilities, the fact that it's so unknowable to humans. There's so much about it we simply do not know, but that's fine. It exists in its own thing. It does what it needs to do, and humans are affecting it by our actions, by various other things, but it's still an interesting thing to consider, to study, and all of those things as well. So yeah, I thought this was a really, really well done piece of nonfiction. And so those are the books that I've been reading this week. I will follow up shortly with some others. I'm really excited to talk a bit more about some of those books. There are some that I'm kind of close to finishing, or audiobooks or whatever, and I'll talk more about them. But in the meantime, have a wonderful week. Speak to you all soon, and take care. Bye-bye.